And good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. My name is Frederick Brown. I am the Deputy Executive Director with Learning Forward. And welcome to our conversation, Drive School Improvement with Principal Learning Teams. So we're going to jump into the content in just a second. But before we do that, I just wanted to walk through a few technical issues. First, before we begin, it's a good time just to review some of the technical aspects of the presentation. So please check the audio setting on your computer, as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues, please see the detailed audio troubleshooting file, which is available in the handouts folder at the very bottom of your screen. And there are also some other icons located at the bottom of the webinar console that open some additional feature panels. You can read about today's speakers in the bio panel and click the handouts panel to download a copy of today's slides. Now, if you want to submit any questions for our speakers to answer during the question and answer session, type them in the Ask a Question box, which is located above the chat window. And so finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. So both the archive and the free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. So let's get started. I've already introduced myself, Frederick Brown, the Deputy Executive Director with Learning Forward, and here are the pictures of the folks who will be talking with us today. Let me just say a little bit about myself. I began my career in education as an elementary teacher in Elyria, Ohio, district about 30 miles west of Cleveland, and then had the opportunity to work with aspiring school principals in Chicago. And prior to joining Learning Forward, was a senior program officer at the New York City-based Wallace Foundation. And it was during my time at Wallace, actually, that I met our next presenter, Wendy Robinson. So, Wendy, you want to say a few words about yourself?
Thank you, Fred. I have been in education probably 42 years. I've had the pleasure of actually being in the same district since I started in kindergarten. I have about 30,000 students in the district, and one of the pleasures of being on this conversation today is to be able to share some of the ways we've used professional learning to impact student achievement.
Thanks, Wendy. And Kay Pinzik, who's also on the line. Kay.
I, too, am delighted to be here and have an opportunity to share some of the learnings that we've experienced in Fort Wayne Community Schools. I was a public school educator for 32 years in the state of Texas and actually retired as Deputy Superintendent from Austin ISD. I really had the wonderful opportunity of being a senior consultant for Learning Forward for 14 years and a wonderful experience working with Fort Wayne Community Schools for the last 10.
All right, thank you, Kay. I'm just going to say very quickly a few things about Learning Forward for those of you who are new to us. Learning Forward, as you see from our tagline, is the Professional Learning Association. And we do pride ourselves as being the only association in North America focused solely on educator professional learning. So given the work that we do and the beliefs that you see here, these really guide our work. And we worked with our Board of Trustees and our stakeholders to arrive at these sets of beliefs. And I'll bring your attention to that fourth bullet because it really connects to the work that we're doing here today, where we believe that district leaders and school leaders create those conditions for learning to thrive, both the learning for our students as well as our adults. And here you see the mission of Learning Forward. It's really about, and we'll talk a little bit later about the standards for professional learning, but it's making that connection between a sound system of learning for the adults and connecting that to what we know will result in increased educator effectiveness and, of course, leading to results for our children. So part of the work that we'll be talking about today, you heard both Wendy and myself talk about the connection back to the Wallace Foundation. Fort Wayne participated in the early generation work of Wallace. And for those of you who have followed the work of Wallace, you know the foundation continues to commission research on leadership. And this notion of leadership as second only to teaching among school influences on student success comes from a report from the University of Toronto and the University of Minnesota. And the last point about the impact is greatest in schools where the greatest need. This is especially relevant to the work that we've done in Fort Wayne. And as you look at this Wallace perspective, where the foundation sought to highlight the 5 key behaviors of effective leaders, you'll hear more about how we make the connection between this work and some of the work that we're doing in the district. But the point with these last 2 slides is the work is grounded in key leadership principles as well as key leadership research. As we move into this next slide, I'm going to ask, first of all, Wendy, can you say more about how the Wallace work influenced Fort Wayne? And then let's start talking about the journey that leads us to the discussion we have today.
I don't think it's an understatement to say that the Wallace Foundation work was the beginning of my thinking as a superintendent, the importance not only of leadership being second only to instruction, but that the key leader of a district has to be the superintendent, so it can't be a disconnected. I have a friend who used to say the speed of the leader is the speed of the group. Wallace helped me expand that idea that leaders have to be at every level of the district. So it's grounded our thinking and really the start of our relationship with Learning Forward.
Thanks, Wendy. So this slide and those that follow will walk us through a journey. And Kay, you're going to get us started talking about how the journey in Fort Wayne began.
As Wendy said, she's been on a long-time journey in this district in building a system that was focused on leadership and how powerful leadership is in terms of transforming a district. We're going to spend our time this morning talking about 9 full steps. The first 4 you see on this slide, which are sort of getting ready steps and preparing for deeply understanding professional learning and leadership. The second 2 will be about how we develop leaders among principals to lead principals, and the last will focus on how principals themselves function in learning communities so that all principals are learning at high levels. So if you take a look at these first 4 steps, you'll see that we have reconstructed them in sort of a visual for you that may help clarify some of the talking that we will be doing around them. But our first step was really to define what leadership and professional learning was all about. Wendy, would you like to comment about the importance of this work?
I think one of the critical things in looking at the cycle that we began started with the cabinet level and the board making a commitment to this work. And if you look at our definition of leadership as we've tried to develop it, you'll see that on the next slide. The process was far more valuable than the actual words. And so the protocols and the types of work that we did to develop this belief about leadership forced us to come to consensus, which also helped with the direction. So the process became extremely critical to that ownership.
So you may want to spend some time just reading their belief about leadership, and then I'll move to the professional learning definition. But as they began to work deeply with their principals back and forth about what leadership is and what professional learning is, people began to own the definitions and personalize it to themselves in their work. Would you add anything to that, Wendy, as I share the next slide on your definition of professional learning?
When you look at our definition, the phrase that stands out for me, and I think is best descriptive of what we've done, is that conversation of collective responsibility for improved student performance. If you look at the types of things that are bulleted there, one thing that sticks out for me is that we often focus on what the teacher needs to do directly in the classroom, and then sometimes teachers focus on what the student needs to do. But if you look at what we've tried to do in terms of defining the connection between professional learning and leadership, leaders at every level in the district have to foster it by creating an environment where everyone understands clearly their role.
So as a first step, developing shared responsibility, shared ownership, seeing themselves in these 2 definitions was a key role, key responsibility of district leadership, but also it led to our next 2 steps, which actually began to craft some of the work. So in step 2, we worked hard to develop what we call a a CASAB process, which is also a part of visioning. So in our Learning Forward literature, the work by Joel and Killian, a CASAB chart actually helps declare what the knowledge, attitudes, skills, aspirations, and behaviors we want to see in principals in order for them to lead effective professional learning. So we have our definitions, what do we want, what do we expect, and then we begin to envision the behaviors, skills, attitudes, and aspirations of those who are leading professional learning at the school. Again, this is a process of engaging the principals in the conversation and involving them in the work so that everyone begins to see themselves in their role in terms of ensuring success every school. Along with that was establishing a theory of change, and I'm sure many of you have been involved in the theory of change literature, but we believed we needed to craft a clearly articulated theory of change of how we moved from where we were to what we wanted to accomplish step by step. So we would all be very clear about the key outcomes and key stepping stones that we would be establishing to make sure that we were successful and to keep us focused. So, Wendy, you want to talk a little bit about the CASAB?
I was just going to add to one of the key pieces to having that definition of professional learning, the definition of leadership, and then the CASAB is to be able to visualize, for principal to be able to be clear about what the expectations are. The other word that comes to mind that was a part of our definition is aligned, alignment. And if you look at the slide that talks about the CASAB, you'll notice at the top it references Michael Fullan's Triple P, which is a part of his work Breakthrough and several other books. As a part of our work with Wallace, we've done what most districts have. We have mission, vision, core values, instructional practices. But since this was around the responsibility of the principal, we wanted to be very clear that not only is this CASAB connected to those knowledge and attitudes and skills, it's also connected to our support system for principals and the behavior and the rubric that we have for the district. We believe in the Triple P, the precision, personalization, professional learning. So as a part of that process, we made absolutely certain that everything we've been talking about for the last 15 or 20 years is demonstrated in our new definitions that we created around professional learning.
As well as, by the way, you have a copy of the district's current CASAB chart. It was revised just a few days ago as the district continues to keep this work current and in the forefront of what their work is and of what they are learning. So it's a very living document. Related to that is the theory of change they developed around principal effectiveness and how they're strengthened the concept that when principals are highly effective, teachers are highly effective, and it positively impacts student learning. So these are those stepping stones that we were talking about. Wendy, you want to add a little bit of information about this work and how it's impacted our work together?
I think this theory of change, as any theory of change, if you look at it, should absolutely have a discipline to it. And so when you look at, illustrated on the screen, the different shades and the different boxes, I would imagine Fred and Kay, we probably spent about a month or two just deciding what words went in the boxes. The other part that we developed as a part of that was a timeline to make absolutely certain that we weren't just checking things off, but that each time we looked at each of the boxes in our theory of change and thought about what we needed to do as pre-work and then how would we know we were ready for the next step. I'm pleased to say I think we're about at step 5, 6, 7, and 8 in terms of right now, after several years of working through this theory of change, actually implementing. And for us, the ability to know we have evidence that the whole professional learning has had an impact always on student achievement, that's probably been the outgrowth of this theory of change. So this year we have used this theory of change to demonstrate school curriculum improvement planning. And normally that's down to lesson plans and standards, and normally would be focused only on teachers. But we believe that as leaders, principals should understand that. So we just completed at our last leadership a process where principals had to bring their skip, as it's termed, and they had to describe how they developed it, how they used their professional learning, and demonstrate to their peers what they knew about the process and then had input from their peers. So if you look at our theory of change, we're actually living what we planned with the help of Fred and Kay.
One of the things that I also heard you tell the group last week was that when they come back in their level meetings, which is with their directors or assistant superintendents, they are to take the feedback they receive from their peers. They're to restructure their process on how they will work with the team to increase the effectiveness of SCIP. And then the district will gather those together so that they can figure out how to differentiate the support to principals who are having more trouble than others in terms of meeting the district's expectation. So that's why I think the district feels that they're moving into that sixth step, providing differentiated professional learning and assuring the implementation of newly acquired skills. They do not plan to leave this work until they're confident all of their principals are very strong in facilitating the learning of adults in the school around school curriculum to ensure that teachers are very confident that they can teach toward the new standards in the state.
And if I might add, I absolutely agree. And if I might add, one of the most powerful pieces for me as a superintendent has been not only does the individual principal understand their role, but their peers have a responsibility to each other. And the beauty of last week was watching the learning occurring peer-to-peer, helping each other with the pieces of that SCIP process. So that would be the only thing I would add.
So as we said in our cycles, step 4 is to ensure that we all guide all of our work with the standards for professional learning. And we as a leadership team are continuing to work to deepen our understanding. Matter of fact, this last week when we were all together, we went back to Stephanie Hirsch's and Shirley Hord's book, Playbook, and took on the standard leadership and continue to deepen our understanding. So as we work together, we are constantly working to internalize the standards so they become natural to us in shaping the future. Fred, would you tell us more about the standards?
Yeah, absolutely, Kay. And one thing before I say something about the standards, I just want to reiterate the commitment the district has made to staying focused on this work. You know, coming out of the conversation that you two just had with each other, it reminds us that so often when districts jump from project to initiative to the next thing, it doesn't allow for the kind of focus that we're seeing in the Fort Wayne Community Schools. So I just applaud the district for staying focused and trying to get real clarity on what it means to have leaders creating those conditions for effective teaching and learning in their buildings. And the standards, as you said, Kay, really create a backdrop for that. I like to think of the standards as a tapestry, and this design that you see before you kind of reminds one of a tapestry, and it shows the interconnectedness among the standards. And so we recognize there's so many types of standards and other protocols that guide our work, but the standards for professional learning are so important because they focus on what are the conditions and what are the outcomes one might expect when one is developing a learning system for the adults in the building or in the school or throughout the district. So of particular relevance to this conversation is the leadership standard, which speaks to the importance of leaders in first understanding the elements of an effective professional learning system, but in addition to that, creating the conditions and advocating for those conditions back in their schools or in their districts. And so this standard really, I think, highlights some of the work that we've done throughout the district together and the work that the principals are doing as well in their schools.
Fred, may I add something to that?
Absolutely.
As we look at the standards, and as Fred says, we're focused on leadership, but what it has led us to is to look at learning design. How do you design effective professional learning for principals? And then it looks at resources. How do we use time? So I think that's how the district has envisioned the tapestry you were talking about, is that we can't just look at one. It always is impacted the whole work is impacted by all the standards.
They're so interconnected, and as people deepen their understanding and exploration of the standards, as you mentioned, Kay, it's hard to imagine working in one area in isolation. You know, another way to think about the standards and their impact on student learning is through the slide that we have here, which again makes the point that if we have an effective professional learning system in place, as informed by the standards, we can expect to see changes in educator knowledge, which is important, but equally important are those changes or improvements in their skills, which we're defining as the application of knowledge, which is a difference. It's one thing to know something, it's something entirely different to be able to utilize that knowledge in order to make a difference. And then, of course, there are dispositions leading to box 3, and this is what we're all focused on, the changes in educator practice. This is what we can observe. This is what we can, in our evaluation systems, monitor. But changes in educator practice, in this case we're thinking about principals, but the same would be true for our teachers and others whose work impacts students, which takes us to that 4th box. So that theory of change in its simplest form is represented by this slide here. And Wendy, I'm going to ask you as we look at this slide, which is another way of saying what I just said, use this slide, Wendy, if you would, just to talk about the work in Fort Wayne and how the standards has impacted that work.
Thank you, Fred. I think I love, first of all, these last 2 slides, the one with the 4 boxes and then this one, because it denotes to me that as you look at the arrows, the work is never done, and as you look at the assumptions, it's a cycle. And I think too often we get into the habit in districts, there's always another challenge, that we check things off. But the ultimate result, and if you look at the assumption slide, is to make sure that there's equity for students. We also believe that if you're making absolutely certain you have equity for your adults and that you're differentiating for them and providing opportunities, then they are better able to have equity for students, and it's all around the whole concept of improving student achievement. But the phrase we use often here in the district is that in the past, professional development was a first-order change. We have transitioned into professional learning, which we consider second order, where you not only change your practices, but you can see direct results from the change in practice. So this whole assumption process and linking it to standards has been critical for our understanding of professional learning.
Thanks, Wendy. It really makes it real when you describe it in ways that connect so directly to the work principals are doing. And you know, as you look at this next slide where we go even deeper into what that work looks like, what else might you add, Wendy, when you think about the principal leaders and how they we're seeking to strengthen that learning for principals system-wide?
As we have developed this whole concept of a professional learning community, which we're trying to make sure that the entire district is one, we see our role in central office as being support. And at the heart of the work is a relationship between the principal and the teachers and staff members, and the teachers and the students and the parents. And so for us, our responsibility at the district level is to create that culture and environment, which we believe we've done with our professional learning system. But at the end of the day, it's the principal, one-on-one, as a group, leading every member of that school community through the value of a professional learning experience. And the part that has been our focus all along is empowering principals to be able to take that next step, not just have events, but actually not be afraid to challenge teachers to ensure that whatever professional learning they're having, they're going to, as a part of support for the teacher, see evidence. So that, to me, has been a critical piece of developing the professional learning community.
And so the district has spent some time really developing, from Wendy's place and her cabinet, developing a strong learning community. The district has worked really hard on developing school leadership teams, quality improvement teams, and supporting the instructional coaches. And this work that we're going to talk about next focuses their work on how principals best learn. How do we build a system in which principals are learning at the same deep level as other teams have been in the district. So if we begin to think about the next two steps and our theory of change, we determined that the district would identify a core group of principals who would, in essence, become lead principals for other principals, so that they began to take on a role of leading their peers to develop strong understandings, processes, and skills to be successful. I know one of the questions that came in was about compensation for this work. And what Fort Wayne has adopted is really Learning Forward's belief that we all have an obligation to learn and to lead, and that is part of an expectation in building strength and power in the district in terms of leadership skills. So again, this is the next slide is sort of a repeat of the slide before it, and we'll begin some of our conversation around the leadership group. Wendy?
I think one of the first things that was puzzling for us at the beginning as we talked about principal leadership teams was to determine the criteria for who would be a part of the leadership team. And quite honestly, the first group of principals we chose to be a part of our leadership teams were based upon the recommendations of their supervisors. We quickly learned that while those were excellent people who provided lots of intensive work for us in planning learning for others, as we started developing that professional learning community and engaging in activities focused on student learning, it was amazing the number of hidden talents that started to surface. And as superintendent, what I took that to mean is once you really clarify for people what professional learning is supposed to look like, and you give people assignments, you end up really almost changing some impressions you have about the work that's actually happening in the district. So one of the topics we'll get to a little bit later is that was a core group. We're looking to expand that group because for us we know that the best use of a leadership team is when they can actually function based upon problems that are occurring rather than district guiding who's on the team and who's not.
So in the beginning, we began to think about what the roles would be. Wendy, you want to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of people on this leadership team?
I think we have a feature here in Fort Wayne that I'm sure other districts have, and maybe it's a different term, but we have what's known as quality improvement teams. As a part of our state school improvement process, we have teachers, administrators, students, if it's age appropriate, and parents involved in creating school improvement plans. As we look at the professional learning opportunities we provided our principals, and we have a very aligned structure of district level, site level, down to this QIT process in the buildings, we would schedule professional learning opportunities based around the standards. So what the principal leaders began doing was their involvement with Learning Forward and the academy work at Learning Forward, they would help plan those specific activities at either the district level or at the high school, middle school, elementary level, which would translate into work into the buildings. So as you can see, most of the work on this slide was around that concept of helping to put into reality all of the theory and all of the structures we put together.
Wendy, if I could jump in because, you're about to mention the Learning Forward Academy. I heard you mention that, and it's going to get described in this next slide.
Yes. So, well.
Okay,
here we are.
Yeah. As you look at this slide talking about the academies, this is one that I can kind of tag team. But one of the things that has been a deep learning for me as a superintendent is that we know that the adult learner is different from student learners, but all adults, all children need to have a concept where they can get the concept and they get to practice the concept, and it's reinforced, then it's monitored, and then they bring it back before true learning actually occurs. So the academies have been an integral part And that the other deep learning we know is that if we only look at what's happening in Fort Wayne, we're not the only districts involved. So, Kay, if you can kind of talk through a little bit of what we did with that academy work, because both you and Fred have been involved in bringing that learning back to the district.
Yes, so the district has actually sent 2 teams of 7 to 2 different academies, and they're planning to send another team as we initiate another group. The academies themselves, Fred can probably speak to better than I, but they take the participants into very deep learning around professional learning, so that when the teams come back from their work at Learning Forward, they have become a learning community themselves. They meet monthly. They share what they're learning. They practice the protocols and processes that the district has decided are important for schools to use. And they talk about ways that they can coach their peers, their peer principals, to help them in developing the skills that they need as well. So you'll see them sitting around in a room actually working through a protocol, and such as a tuning protocol, and giving each other feedback, and then designing professional learning for their peers so that it actually strengthens all principals in the district. So we can talk a little bit about what our leaders do. Wendy, you want to share a little bit about that?
I think one of the critical pieces to this concept of professional learning at the district level and how you sustain it, we have several levels of professional learning communities that meet on a monthly basis. And the very first week, the first group is a professional learning community led by the superintendent and cabinet, who are my upper level people responsible for all parts of the district. And part of what we absolutely believe is the strongest part of what we do is to model what is expected. So if I'm expecting for people to own their own learning, if I'm expected for people to be able to communicate to the people who are involved in school improvement planning, then I have to demonstrate that I am as involved in learning the standards and I am working through the protocols. So what the learning teams do, and I think we've mentioned it before, but the academy is when we send them off to a Learning Forward conference, and they have a 2-year cycle or a 3-year cycle where they're working through. But we have what's called a core team, which is made up of the cabinet members, including myself, along with members of that team, and we process new concepts. We have done several books studies. Kay mentioned Playbook, Coach's Craft. We have gone through several Learning Forward publications that deepen our learning. So basically the expectation is not just that small group we sent. As Kay said, we're going to be expanding, but the ultimate goal is any one of the 53 principals in this district, by the time we're done with the cycle, will be able to lead other groups in professional learning activities.
And some of those strategies include things like, how do you plan your school improvement plan, incorporating a strong theory of change and logic model? How do you organize professional learning at your school and capitalize on effective learning designs, which are like unit plans that would take people into new practices? So all of us are studying different ways to really ensure high-quality work at every school for every principal, and in turn trying to figure out ways to monitor our progress. So often we turn around and say, okay, let's look at the student performance data. But as we were looking at Fred's 4 squares, we also need to know, number one, are adults shifting their practices in any way based upon our CASAB, what we wanted them to do? If so, what are the results? If not, what do we need to do to support and assist them in their learning journey? So that has become a really important part.
And if I might add, Kay, excuse me, but I think one of the things that was also very critical for us is you can send people off to do all of that, but they have to have an expectation of what it is they're going to do that can be measured and compared across the district. So at the beginning of the year, language arts, math, and cultural proficiency. So we have very deliberately given schools specific topics to cover in their SIP plan understanding all 53 buildings are at totally different places in terms of planning or even in terms of what their student data says. But if we can have common conversation, that facilitates this whole learning team structure.
And Lindsay, I see your question about if you do not have a strong team at the superintendent and principal level, do you think you can have a strong teaching team? I think we'd all say absolutely. We have evidence of that all over our country and internationally, where we have strong schools, we have strong teaching teams. But if we're talking about a district being a learning community and expecting all students to achieve at high levels, then it is imperative that superintendents develop the skills that they need to be successful and principals develop strong professional learning skills themselves, because then not all children can be successful. So yes, we have evidence that we can have strong teaching teams without strong principals and without strong superintendents, but we can't meet the moral purpose that we have of all children being successful when some of us are not strong.
Okay, I love that point, and the way you describe. I think about how do you take work to scale and make sure that you just don't have pockets of excellence, but as you said, you have excellence across the board. I think it's an important point to emphasize.
So we have discussed 6 major stepping stones in our journey, and here are our last 3. And they become a little, as Wendy was talking about, second order change is a little fuzzy because we're literally involved in it. And it feels sometimes as though it's not as cleanly articulated as when we defined what professional learning is. But our next 3 steps are really critical in our journey and in our cycle. So you see that developing skill and facilitating professional learning around the district's vision for learning. So I'll take just a minute to talk about that so we're not unclear about the focus of the district. Through Wendy's leadership, the district is very focused on curriculum and instruction, teaching and learning, and cultural proficiency. So when we say the district's vision for learning, the district has crafted a clearly articulated vision for what we would see in the classroom, in the school, around teaching and learning, and has established a learning agenda. And if you read Learning Forward's material, it's a learning agenda is an array of learning designs. And in their learning agenda, they have learning designs around curriculum mapping, assessments of and for learning, instructional design, and analyzing student work. So in step 7, we're very clearly focused on a few priorities of the district and not a ton of things that are schools that can go anywhere they want to. They're within the structure of the district's expectation. And step 8 is around learning teams, and step 9 is about how we will really do this work in a variety of learning communities. So we're going to spend some time talking about the notion of principals in professional learning teams. Wendy?
I think one of the critical pieces of this whole process is that as districts, I'm struck by that question about can you have a professional learning community at a school level if you don't have it at the district level. And I think that what you suffer if you don't approach it from a district level, from the superintendent, everyone involved in the process, is that this too shall pass concept. And the whole professional learning team gave us an opportunity, that concept as we've developed it, to not just talk about and checklist those principals who have no problem explaining to you what they're doing in their classroom or what's happening in their classrooms. But we are a district with an extremely mobile population. So we made the commitment that we can't allow there to be shining points of light. We needed to have all of our schools, if we get back to that equity concept. And the only way for us this made sense was that the principals understood clearly their role. And as you can see here, that concept of problems of practice. because we wanted them to be able to be in an environment where they were comfortable telling their peers, telling the people who evaluate them, discussing with the superintendent, discussing at board meetings, issues they address through this process. And if you can kind of go to the next slide, which I think, if I'm listening to this conversation, I would ask myself the so what question. I think that being very deliberate, having that theory of change, having the cycle of improvement, attitudes toward leadership are beginning to change. You just can't check in and check out. It's a constant process that everyone's involved, and so you have to be ready to be involved in those conversations. We've invested heavily in building coaches. Out of our 53 buildings, we have over 125 coaches, specifically in the areas of language arts and math, because we know not only do teachers need coaching, the next cycle for us is developing coaching for principals. And principals, we've surveyed them, amazingly are very open to wanting that because they see the positive results of having that help. The collective responsibility I shared earlier at our last leadership meeting last week, we just began the event, gave instructions, and for an hour and a half, teams of principals and teams of assistant principals helped each other evaluate and make stronger the work they were doing. The risk-taking, but more than anything else, that whole alignment to expectations. We have professional learning to ensure we're going to get our goals met. So if I could, I want to turn over to Kay to talk just a little bit about an email she received. She was sharing this with me right before we came on, which I think illustrates what we're beginning to see happen.
I will try to address a question that flew through the chat box a few seconds ago. Do principals have to, as instructional leaders, have to have expertise in all the unique content areas? One of the things we've worked on is to say that principals need expertise in curriculum design. So they do not have to have expertise in science because science teachers have expertise in science. But how does the principal help teachers shape their curriculum standards, their assessments in a way that ensure mastery of the curriculum? That's what we believe principals need expertise in. And so that's where you see in the learning design, the principal has a unit design that would help them walk a team through how to map the curriculum, how to design effective assessments that give you quality information, the instructional framework, how to use that in an effective way, and then how to have protocols and practices that would allow teachers, facilitate teachers clearly in analyzing student work. So their expertise is not in content areas as much as it is in what is the principal as a curriculum leader in their school. So when we say greater alignment, again, it has kept us all very, very focused on what the goal's two primary roles are. And if you remember, the SCIP is the School Curriculum Implementation Plan, which we believe the principal is responsible for. So this is an email that I received from a teacher the other day through the principal that I thought was an interesting thing to share. I wanted to let you know how using the SCIP in our data room has really helped with planning our 6th grade language arts. Being able to see the SCIP up on the wall gives us a great visual for each quarter, and we no longer are guessing as to what should be taught and when. After adding acuity and I-STEP testing dates and identifying critical and important standards, we're able to place standards in quarters where we are sure to hit them prior to testing. I feel like we are on the right track now and can be successful in the next phase of creating units for each of our quarters and making it flow together. This is what I was hoping we would get to again as a district as far as curriculum planning and mapping goes. I missed it from years ago. Thanks again, and please let me know if I can help. So the whole idea of ensuring that this work is actually happening at the district level is at the school level, not just at the district level, is a primary concern to Fort Wayne and our work, which really takes us to our next slide, and this is probably where we are currently, and that is how do we know that it matters. So we have begun to look at different processes and systems to give us information. As Wendy said, we are expecting the work to come back to leadership, where she facilitates, and level meetings where the directors facilitate. So principals bring their school improvement plans, they bring their professional learning plans, they bring their SCIP documents, and they talk about the processes of professional learning and how they align with the standards in order for us to assess and to differentiate support. So we are looking also at the standards assessment inventory, which is Learning Forward's perception inventory given to all staff that was given this fall, and we're going to gather that data to determine how staff are perceiving professional learning to help us with planning. We're gathering artifacts, we're conducting observations and walkthroughs this year in very systematic ways as part of the district's learning design. And most important, Learning Forward and Wendy and her team are in constant communication, so our ongoing planning for our time together is based upon what we're learning as we assess the impact. Wendy, do you have a story to tell us?
I most certainly do. I think Kay mentioned briefly the concept of walkthroughs because we've tried to create an environment where having central office staff members, people who ultimately evaluate principals, be in buildings on a regular basis, helping support the principal, observing them leading QITs, observing them as they're working on the instructional side. Those are all critical. We had one of my level leaders who was going to visit a building to be a part of one of the SCIP planning sessions. And she got kind of a panic call the day before she was supposed to go because the teachers at a certain grade level that was going to be observed realized that they thought they really had it going on with the SCIP. They knew what they were supposed to do, had a beautiful SCIP, and as they were preparing for this observation, realized what they had planned and what they were actually teaching were not aligned. And so their first reaction was, we can't have somebody come and observe because we're not ready. Now, because the leader has been a part of Learning Forward, knew enough to say, but that's exactly what we want to have happen, because completing the SCIP is not the issue. The conversations around the SCIP, the taking ownership as to whether what you're teaching every day results in quality instruction, which changes student achievement. So those are the kind of things that we know are occurring in the district based upon the fact that classroom teachers have just as much responsibility as the principal, as the level, as the superintendent.
And I would love to end there because I think that's a powerful statement. We've had one more question, and what do we mean by artifacts? So we are asking principals to actually bring the curriculum documents to sessions, and we're calling that an artifact. We are videotaping coaching sessions and sessions out in the building so we can observe how teams are working on the curriculum work. And so we consider all of those actual products in the hands as a result of the work our artifacts. Fred?
So as we move forward, and there's been a lot of conversation on the details of the work, and Wendy and Kate, thank you so much for painting a picture of what that work looks like in practice. You know, I want to just hit one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time before we jump into a story from the district. Someone asked, I think it was Gail Hume who asked, and we touched on this, if we could describe the types of conversations we'd had with our principals to make sure that they were engaged in continuous improvement and learning. So we've touched on this. We've talked about some of the artifacts that pushed us into those types of conversations. Wendy, what else would you say, or Kay, what else would you say the district has done to help make sure the conversations are focused on continuous improvement and learning for both the adults and the students? Anything else you would add to that that might help with Gail's question?
I think the biggest thing we've done is to absolutely understand and have public conversations around it, leadership meetings around it, teacher meetings around the fact that we're professionals and the sole goal we have is improving student achievement. So I think if you approach it from the standpoint of it's all about the student learning, and in order for students to learn, adults have to change their practices, you just constantly have those conversations. But more than that, every time you're bringing them together for a leadership opportunity, the expectations you have around the school improvement planning, we have standardized the expectation for format. Before I became superintendent, we had 53 different ways of doing school improvement, which meant that you had no understanding of whether all of the things you expected to have happen were actually happening. And so I think that there has to be some standardization of meeting structures, of things that are expected. But I think the biggest thing is to be flexible enough that all those definitions, all the things we created, we talk about it enough, but more than that, we expect people to demonstrate that they understand it during their job performance. So I just think, Fred, I can't say that there's any big thing that we do except that when we come together as leaders, we know the conversation is around professional learning and its impact on student achievement.
And we look at both the work the adults are doing along the way as well as the final product, because we go back to the 4 boxes. If we just start with analyzing student work or analyzing the data, we have to say, well, what shifts in adult practice occurred along the way. So we're analyzing the upfront work. Are teachers planning well? Do teachers teach toward the standards? Are they using effective assessment? So we're analyzing, gathering artifacts and analyzing all of that data as well as the so what data if they have indeed changed their practice, developed quality school improvement plans, developed quality curriculum plans, developed quality assessments, and we're still not getting the results that we want in student outcomes. We need to go back in those processes of adults and look for the breakdowns. Because we believe strongly that it's shifts in adult practice that lead to increases in student learning.
And Fred, I think it goes back to the CASAB, because I'm a strong believer that you won't get increased student adults until you do improve adult behavior. And so clarifying the expectations, clarifying what exemplary looks like, but then also providing a system of support. We tell people here you get supported until the day before your final evaluation occurs. Up until that time, it's a system of support. Now, are we perfect? No, but we're trying to create that environment where the expectation is for the adult to be a learner 24/7, and we're real clear around the areas that we're going to provide support.
I just saw a question, too, about time, and then I'm just trying to follow the questions and try to answer some of them. And the question is, how long did this take? Well, to get to where we are, we've been working 4 heavy, strong years together, but I would end that by saying it's an eternal lifetime journey, that this is a cycle of continuous improvement, that there's never a moment in time where we'll say, we are done. But we are always engaged in learning, and each time we learn, we get stronger, and when we get stronger, students benefit.
Thanks, Kay and Wendy. And I know one of the things we wanted to do is just we've told some stories along the way of how this work looks in the district. Wendy, you had another story you wanted to tell just to illustrate how this all looks and to sort of put it into perspective.
I think one of the critical pieces, we mentioned the school improvement planning process. And our state, unlike other, just I'm sure the same as other states, is in the process of changing standards, changing assessments, changing what that process looks like. But I think for me, when I had a teacher say to me, we were leaving one of our QIT meetings and we had gone over the SCIP process, and we were explaining that all of the different schools could be at different levels, but here was the expectation and the support. And I walked over to the table, and I just asked, I said, now, did any of this make sense? Because I conduct those meetings. And she leaned forward and she looked at me, and she said, I get it. You're not expecting for me to be perfect, but you expect for me to keep working at it. So I think if that's the attitude that you can develop down to the teacher level, that no, everybody, all 1,900 aren't going to be at the same place at the same time, but there is a destination, and there is a process for improvement.
I mean, that's a great example because it makes it real. And when people are seeing this work and living this work and then can make those kind of connections, it's certainly, because I think all of us would agree that if you're in a district of this size, and you are, Wendy, the largest district in Indiana, am I correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so in a district your size, for teachers to be able to see this work that's happening and starting at the Central Office Cabinet, and they can experience it in their own way in the buildings, that's a very powerful testimony and a very powerful statement. You know, one of the questions, and you hit upon this a little bit, that came in, I think it was Tom Sawyer who asked this question. You touched on this in response to Gail's question about balancing that top-down and decentralized approaches to district management of professional development or professional learning. How have you, can you just say a bit more about how you have found that balance in Fort Wayne?
Well, absolutely. I think it goes back to the school improvement planning process. There has to be a professional learning plan attached to every portion of their school improvement planning process. Now, that's why we have the coaches. That's why we have a whopping 5 people in our professional learning department. But we combine resources from Title I, Special Ed, and Curriculum Department. They have to look at their data. They have to look at their strategies. And so while this big overarching learning system professional cycle is in place, every individual school has to, what does that mean for them? What resources do they need? So we don't dictate what happens at the school level. We define what the results need to be, and then we provide resources, and it's up to them to demonstrate to us that they actually know what it is they need.
We also had a question from James Mason about the ongoing cycle and how to induct new people into the district. One of the great things about communities of learners is that they induct new members to their team. So although there is a sort of a process for new teachers, a learning community for all new teachers that would, over a year or two's period of time, bring them up to speed in teaching and what new teachers need. Our approach to inducting new people is to bring them into the community of learners so they become part of that community and they don't see themselves as an outsider or even new. They become part of the team. We've had several new members on cabinet, and that is just the approach. They join the district leadership team, and they are part of the team, and they continue their learning journey.
We also provide mentors. We tier what we think in a positive way our principals. And if you're a first-year principal or new to the district, you may be seasoned but new to the district, not only do they go through all the other professional learning opportunities, but we try to give them some pre-work or give them some additional coaching and assign them to a stronger, more mature principal in terms of having been in the district. So as Kay says, it's learning on the job, but there's a safe person to ask questions of.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, I know we're reaching the top of our hour, and this has been a great conversation. Before I ask both Kay and Wendy for a final word, I just want to remind folks, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you see the folders section, and there you'll find several things, including the archived version of this, of the PowerPoint, and a resource that shows some of the tools that we've been describing as we've gone through this conversation. I also encourage you to look at the video link that's there. This is a video that was done in partnership with School Improvement Network, which came out to help us capture at least a part of the story of what's happening in Fort Wayne. And as you'll hear Wendy Robinson say in the video, we're not there yet, but we're making our way to our vision for effective professional learning for principals in the district. So as we approach our last minute, you see our contact information. First, I'm going to let Wendy have the final word. So Kay, what final statement would you make about this work in Fort Wayne?
It's been a joy to watch a district truly transform itself into a professional learning system, and I'm grateful I've had an opportunity to be a part of it, and thank all of you so much for joining us today and letting us share what we're learning here.
Thanks, Kay. And Wendy, the final word.
At the end of the day, it's all about the value we're adding to students and the results the students are able to achieve and the opportunities. And so professional learning, if it's not tied to that concept of student learning and increasing learning, it's just an event. So we always keep in mind what the end should be. And thank you for being a part of this process today.
So thanks, Kay, thanks, Wendy, and thanks to all of you for your commitment to educator effectiveness and results for our children. This concludes the webinar that we have for today. Remember, you can still access this later and share it with colleagues and friends. We really appreciate the work that you're doing, and at this point, we conclude our time together. Have a wonderful rest of day and rest